Hi folks, I'm International Master and this is John Watson. This is Ask the Master on ICC TV. The main idea of the show is to provide players with a forum to ask questions about chess and the chess world. You can send these questions in advance, and really that's the best way, by email to askimwatson@chessclub.com. That's ASKIMWATSON at chessclub.com. Got a little feedback there. And I'll generally give priority to questions that I've received beforehand, so the earlier you get them to me, the better. There are other ways to submit questions in advance. You can, for example, send a message to my ICC account, John L. Watson, JOHNLWATSON. That's a little more awkward, so the email is probably a better technique. But also you can ask a question live right now on the channel, and let me check that for a second, see who's on. Here we go, there's Jonathan Russell, and we'll be hopefully getting some more people on here soon. We've had a lot of questions live on the chat recently, a lot of people, so hopefully this will be a good day for that. And usually what I do is I start out, now you can ask about anything related to chess. You can ask about the chess events of the world, like the Tata Steel is going on now, about players, about strategy. We get most of our questions about openings, a lot of questions about openings, chess books, chess videos, or really anything you can think about. You can also talk with each other on the chat. Once we get some people piled up on the chat, you can comment back and forth. I think that's always fun. I sort of follow that on the side with sidelong glances at the screen. And yeah, here's some people coming on. Good, this is great. So I thought I'd start out as I usually do by just showing something. I was sent a game. Now remember, you can send games too. So again, that's askimwatson@chessclub.com. And I thought I'd start out by just showing, someone sent me a game and it seems pretty instructive. The main thing I like with games is they don't have to be good really, but if they have some sort of lesson or a question that you have involved with it or something that would be of general interest, it usually isn't too good to get a 1-minute game where people throw away 5 pieces and then there's a back rank made or something. It's nice if it's, it doesn't have to be a good quality game, but it should be a game that has some good, solid questions to ask in terms of, say, strategy or something of that sort. Is nice. Or maybe how to play the opening, or how to play the middle game, or what happened in this end game, that kind of thing. Okay, so this is a game that a reader sent. It's a really excellent example of the English opening. And let me just do this. So this is kind of nice. Now White's idea here is to control light squares along the long diagonal. Very typical English opening idea, also controlling here. And the viewer who sent this was White. Okay, now there's a double attack on d5, and so now this is a very interesting move. It was invented many, many years ago, actually Botvinnik used to play it in the old Soviet Union. So really, it's a 1930s opening, and 30s and 40s. And a lot of the Russians played it for a while. I remember Lev Albert used to play this all the time. And it looks like a crazy move. You're wasting time. You could have just exchanged, for example, and sometimes people do. The thing is, then you strengthen White's center. There's another pawn supporting the move d4. And you get rid of a developed piece, and you open up this nice file for White's rook coming down that way. So what other options are there? Well, you could just protect it. But then there's problems with sometimes losing a pawn there. I won't go into any detail, but that can be risky. I mean, even immediately there's this idea of trying to win that pawn right away. Because the idea being that if the pawn advances, there's bishop b7. I don't know if that's for sure a real problem because there's knight c6, but I think it's not something people play very often anyway. And it's a little passive too. And you could retreat to other squares. But this square has a nice advantage, which is it covers key squares. And Black's idea now is to set up a Maroczy bind as Black, with the pawns on e5 and c5, and you'll notice it's hard to stop that. How are you going to stop that from happening? Because if you play knight f3, which I think he did, then he plays knight c6. Well, the next move is e5. That's the idea. So it's a familiar position, but White's a tempo ahead of what he normally would be. It's a reverse color kind of position. Okay, so White castles, and here's where this game gets interesting. It tries that move. Probably not that great a move, but very logical. Because Black's idea is to control these squares. It's the same idea as with e5, actually. Same thing as to control the dark squares. Sorry, let's go back another move. The idea is to control dark squares, but instead he's going to do it by taking over the long diagonal and keeping his bishop active here. The only problem is when the bishop floats this way, there's less control of these queenside squares, and there's immediate tactical issues. So really the best move now, well, let me just show you. White plays that move, very logical, controls more light squares. Remember, he's trying to control these squares. But he has a more radical solution, which is to play here. And it's just awkward to defend this. If black has to play e5, which by the way, I think is the best move, well, it's a little inconsistent with having the bishop come both this way and going, now the bishop isn't going to go to g7. There are many more natural moves than e5, but none of them are that good. The main problem is this move, which was played early on in this variation, which looks okay because when white plays this very radical move, trying to break through and win something, and black captures it, if white captures this, hoping to exploit that pin along the diagonal, black can just capture, because if white takes this, it's defended by that knight. So there's another reason that knight is well placed on c7. And black just won material there. So white can't play that tactic. But strange to say, he can play this move, this pawn up move, and then just simply not recapture, but play here. And now the problem is there's ideas of taking this knight, which protects the rook, and then taking this pawn and attacking that knight, and the knight can't take because the rook hangs in the corner. And so it just turns out that after a little bit of, I'll show you how that goes, black can try and defend the pawn, white captures it, black captures, white takes the knight, and then takes the rook and has a small material advantage. Now it's not that easy. There's more to be looked at here. It's a little complicated, but white is better here. White ends up with a little bit of material. That's the idea here. For example, just brings the bishop back. Black plays very aggressively and has two bishops. You'd think he might have enough. No, white protects that square, but it just turns out that because white has the extra material, he's able to see. Black doesn't have an extra pawn. It's a full exchange for white. So it turns out there's just no way to really make this work. The problem now is if you try to win the queen down here, this queen is hanging. In other words, check here, and that one's hanging too. So basically that's all known. That's all sort of known theory. So probably this is a mistake, but white didn't know that at the time and played this move. And now white played a nice move. He attacked the kind of the loose pawn. We talked about that. Since e5 hasn't been played, there's no bishop naturally protecting that pawn. So that's a good move. Probably even better would be to play this anyway, but at least this time black can play this move, b6, fairly safely. It turns out white's probably better there too, but that's just technical stuff. Won't worry about that too much. So that's nice, a direct attack on that. And black could just defend it, and that's probably the best move. But he plays here, and now white plays the rook over. It makes sense. Look what white's doing. White's aiming his bishops at that side of the board. This is a very well played game, by the way. And getting the rook out to an open file against the same kind of target over there. And now there's moves like knight a4 and knight e4 and things like that can happen. So let me take a quick look at this. Okay, black plays over. Now the reason for that is he still wants to play b6, but he doesn't want to be vulnerable on that long diagonal. That's the idea there. And white plays a very logical move, coming down. And the person who sent me this game noticed that this is a good move, but that's just because it takes more pieces off of that square, and it means that b6 can't be played because the bishop takes c6 check. So this is actually quite a good move. For example, something like this and this. It just turns out tactically this is a problem for black. It's hard to sort of defend everything. This bishop takes is a kind of a very useful move to make. This is just a difficult position. It's not the end of the world, but for example, if black castles, then you're actually going to lose that pawn, I think. Knight here, and there's no way to defend that pawn because b6 loses here. So that was maybe a clever way to play. It doesn't give you that big an advantage, but it gives you some advantage. Instead he plays back, and that's sort of a standard idea in the English Open. So take a look at this. What's really going on here? White's playing the English Open. Why does he want to play with less space? Look, black has more space, more control of the center. Very nice bishop controlling the center. The two knights are controlling the center. But black is a little behind in development. He hasn't castled, and that bishop hasn't gotten out. And white's got very nice development. Every one of his pieces has a purpose. This bishop has a beautiful long diagonal. This bishop, let me get rid of some of those arrows. This bishop has a nice diagonal and a target. This knight can come into very nice squares attacking on the queen side. And the other knight here can also come to nice squares here or here, or maybe even d5 can be a square that knight can go to. And the rook's already on an open file against a target. So the idea is that black has some big advantages here in the center, but white has his own advantages. So it's kind of an even game. It's just an interesting game. Black plays there. That looks like a bizarre move, but one of the ideas is that if the queen comes out here to further attack that square, he wants to be able to just move this knight and have the queens opposing. So, and the other thing is that it prepares b6 because it protects the knight on c6. See how that goes? Now that's protected against bishop takes knight, so b6 can be played next. Black's just trying to control the center. He doesn't care about anything else. So white goes there. Now there's an idea of maybe doubling pawns on the c6 square, and also maybe an idea of winning this pawn down here on a7. So black plays to defend that square with knight there, and white takes that. And the point is that black can't take back because of this move. And that rook is trapped, by the way. And you also just want a pawn for nothing. You're even on the other pawn. So this is trouble. If nothing else, you want a pawn. So he has to take back this way. Well, the only problem now, that's nice. Black still has more space in the center, but now black has a problem. Not only is he a little behind in development, but he's blocked off his best piece. And even the knight can't even go to the square that it might have wanted to go to. So black's pieces are less effective now all of a sudden. On the other hand, black has two bishops. It's a bishop pair. Okay, so white develops, and black plays. Now this is the other way to play, of course. You can put this here and think about putting a knight on that square. And that's, for example, some line like this and this. That's a very strong knight, and there's a lot of little tactics involved here. And then maybe just double. This was actually given to me as an annotation by the person who sent me the game, so I think it's absolutely right. He's right. This is better for white. It's just too hard to prevent. There's a lot of pressure on the queen side here. Things like knight takes pawn followed by bishop takes. These rooks are going to get active on the queen side. Notice that black's rooks don't have any open files. So really white's strategy of emphasizing these light squares and the long diagonal has kind of worked. So let's just keep going here. So he castles. Plays knight e4 anyway, good move. And now black really could just kind of consolidate. It looks ridiculous, but he should probably get out of the way of his bishop. Now that he's gotten castled, to kind of get out of the way of his bishop, and then just sort of make a move like this to protect that a pawn. And even though white has very aggressive knights, they're not really going anywhere. And so it turns out this position's fairly even, actually, oddly enough. Black's about to play there and drive the knight away. So it's complicated, and I'm not going to. The idea of going over this game is just to show you the ideas, not the exact particulars. But black was really okay in this position, but he has to make a very kind of subtle move. Instead, he kind of lashes out with a move that's kind of weakening. And this is a little different. It's the exact same kind of position, but now there's a big weakness on e6 for one thing, and also white has sort of an extra move because black hasn't played that a6 move. So the person that sent this gives this move, attacking the queen side, which makes so much sense. Once you've got all your pieces really well placed and active, see all these pieces are so active and forwardly placed. Look how knights are active, the queen's active. And a lot of times you use your pawn to drive away the other person's pieces and make for open lines. So that would be a good move. And you could follow it by just, for example, doubling your rooks. English opening can be a very strong opening. It's very irritating for black, because black has plenty of space, but there's nothing much he can do here. Instead, white played this move, aiming at that weak square. Very good move. Maybe not quite as good, but still very an excellent idea. So black has to defend this. This is a fork square, so black defends it. And then white plays check. Now it turns out this was a good place to just cash in on that long diagonal, and the way to do that was simply to take this. And that's winning a pawn, and then you have pieces. You have three pieces on that square. And he may have thought that there was a way of getting back the b pawn, but it just doesn't turn out right. I'll show you how that works. Something like this, this, and now rook b2 is actually a mistake at this point because of knight e6. It's just very strong. And it's just such a wonderful, wonderful square there. There's nothing much black can do to stop problems here. Let me see if I can show you that. For example, something like this. And this is just big trouble because black, for example, black takes something like that. Then you have this move, and there's no stopping rook c8. Just too many weaknesses around black's king here. That's why f5 was a problem. It created big weaknesses. So he should have cashed in that pawn at this point. White should have. Instead, he played their very natural move, covering e6 again. And now maybe the knight could go back again. That was suggested by the person who sent the game. But on the other hand, I think black's kind of okay here. His pieces have gotten much more active. So he played a very natural move there. Can't be bad, can it? And black took. He could just move the queen and took. And now white got rid of what's usually a very good piece. And so white has bishop versus knight now. The problem is black still has a little more space. So this bishop is better than this knight. When you've got pawns on both sides of the board, this is a good thing to know. When you've got pawns on both sides of the board, bishops tend to be better than knights. And the fewer pieces, the better. I mean, the bishops will tend to win some endgames. But this one's fairly even because black has a lot of space to deal with. So anyway, the game went very briefly now. I think it ended right there. Yeah, it's very close to equal. Black might just play this move. If white starts trying to take on that square, then the rook can come down and take here in return. So a great game, very interesting, very double-edged, very interesting, very well played by both sides. And hopefully you learned a little something about that English Open. Send me your games. Okay, so now we've got some, let me go to the chat, as usual, and we'll start looking here. What's an easy way to reach a 2,000 rating? I'm 1,700 right now, some training advice, please. Well, I don't know if there's any easy way. You have to play a lot, that's number one. When you're 1,700 trying to get to 2,000, the most important things are playing, first of all. Studying is very important. You should study whatever you think you're weakest at. You can always study things like master games. They're always going to teach you things. Most people need to improve their openings because they lose too many quick games in the opening. Opening study is actually a little underrated sometimes, I think, because you learn a lot about middle games when you're studying openings too. You'll find all of the up-and-coming players know their openings very well, and that's important because then you sort of know what to do once you get out of the opening too, and you don't get too far behind on time, on the clock. So that's really big. And then study anything you think you're weak at. You should know your basic endings for sure. Absolutely know all your standard endings. That'll help you. There's no doubt that'll really help you. You have to know all of the basic, not just mates, but things like basic rook and pawn endgame positions. And just get an ending book and look at your main endings. I don't think you have to study complex endings yet, probably not at the 1,700 level. You won't get them very often for one thing, so there's a practical issue there. Let me just see here. We've got okay, so I would say playing and studying. Study your opening, study some endgames, but try and figure out what part of the game you've studied least and where you're losing, where you're losing games. Very tough question. It's very hard to get. Many people will tell you how hard it is to get from 1,700 to 2,000. Okay, I had actually scrolled down too far to start with. So what was the? How simple or complicated was that main three Carlsen missed against Kiri? It's incredibly easy. Almost any player, maybe even me, would have seen it. I don't know. It's the first time in Carlsen's career that he hasn't just played a simple, easy mate. The reason it's simple is because it's just direct checks, and there's no sacrifices. It's just check, checkmate. It's really so simple. My suspicion was that he had thought the game was completely winning. Well, it was, of course, and he had already looked at the move he played, which was this bishop takes, I think it was f7, and probably thought that was leaving him way ahead materially with an easy win. So maybe he didn't even bother to look at anything else, and then realized afterwards that the king could go running up to e5, and all of a sudden realized it might not even be a win. It actually was a win. He had to win the next move, but it was very hard to find. Very hard to find. I actually ended up commenting on that game. Fascinating game. That was my day for commenting on Vacanze, and it was an amazing thing. I'd say the first time probably since Carlsen's been playing chess professionally, since he was 14 years old, that he ever missed anything remotely like that. I would even go so far as to say most top players, most of the top 100 players in the world have really only missed something like that probably once. Actually, we've all missed stuff like that, but we had no time. Carlsen had tons of time. Time wasn't even an issue at all. He had all the time in the world to think about it, which is the reason I think that he must have been so sure he was winning that he didn't even look for a better move than bishop takes. There's really no other much of an explanation. If he looked even more than a few seconds, obviously he would have found the mate. So the answer is very easy. Okay, advice for someone playing their first big weekend tournament. Get some rest, and don't get discouraged. Most of the people you're playing have played a million tournaments, So it's frustrating to play against them because they have so much more experience than you do. Go in and have fun. Just go in. Try and get your opponents to talk about the game afterwards. They'll probably be better players than you are, and they'll probably be able to give you some good advice. And go in with a nice, relaxed attitude. Just try to make good moves. Don't assume that your opponents are all playing perfectly, though. They may make some big blunders. So keep your eyes out for major blunders. Even good players will sometimes just make some horrible mistakes. So go in. Don't defer too much to your opponents. Don't think that they're so good that they'll never make a mistake. Just play as if you were playing a casual game at home against a friend. Okay, the mating pattern was similar to the end of the rapid play. Yeah, see, I don't really think it was that similar. That point was making, but the big difference there is that there was a check drawing away the king. The queen h6 check, you probably all saw that. The nice queen sacrifice, queen h6 check, king takes, rook h8 mate. That's really a whole different ball game because you had to drag the king away, and in fact you had to give up your queen to do that. So that can be missed. That kind of move can be missed. This kind of move is almost impossible to miss. I think, like I say, Carlsen's played thousands of games, and then you throw in the exhibitions. I mean, what's he played? Tens of thousands of games, and never missed anything like this, I don't think. So that's how amazing it was. It really was very exceptional, especially with so much time left on the clock. Yeah, I mean, the pattern was the same in the sense there's a rook h8 made, but much easier to find. Okay, I seem to be, okay, let's go. What's the best way to play with black against the Grand Prix attack? White puts the bishop on b5 and gives check. Well, that's not the Grand Prix attack if he gives check. But I know what you're talking about. Let me see. Feign shadow or e6. Can you discuss the ideas in the ready opening? Let me scroll down. I'll come right back to that Grand Prix question. Semi-Tarrasch setup. We have talked about that. We'll do some more on that. Okay, we've got some great questions. The Scotch, there's this knight f5 line that goes, oh yeah, why doesn't white play this? Oh, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah. Okay, so that's a good start. Now let me go back up and go in order here. Let's talk about that Grand Prix. Now, just strictly speaking, the Grand Prix is going to go like this. Oh, I'm getting all kinds of light in here. It's hard for me to see. Strictly speaking, the Grand Prix is this opening, where you play the knight out. It's a closed Sicilian, where you play f4, like that. And then black can play, as you say, either g6 or e6. Those are the main endings. There's other things you can play. You can play a6, too. And the one you were talking about, the idea of playing bishop b5, for example. There's two Grand Prix ideas for white. One is bishop c4. That was kind of the original idea, with just a direct attack planned. d3, castles, queen e1, h4. You can win a lot of games that way. Then the more positional idea is bishop b5. And then the most common answer is knight d4, but we won't get into that. Okay, now, but you asked about the check, and what you're really talking about is what's called the Moscow variation. That's a little different. That happens after this move and d6 and check now. It's called the Moscow variation. Should I put my bishop or knight on d7? They're both okay. The knight is more ambitious. People who want to win tend to play this move. And white's usually pretty happy with that because it gives him more winning chances too. Bishop d7 tends to be a little kind of dull is the problem. I mean, it's very good. It's probably the best move. It's the one played most often, objectively the best. But it's hard to get winning chances for either side, really, especially for black, I would say. Very safe line for white. And a lot of players who play the Sicilian want a lot of winning chances, so that's one of the reasons you don't see it as often. There's a lot of lines here. I don't know if it's worth trying to go into this, but for example, something like, let me just show you one of the things that happens pretty often. White plays for d4, but black just counterattacks in the center. So you get things like this. Very, very common variation right here. Like that. And the knight's well enough placed that you have to get rid of it. And then you can get positions like this. And there's a lot of variations, very well-known variations that stem from bishop b5 check, but they're all okay for black if he plays well. On the other hand, it's very safe for white, so it's one way to play. So my answer would be, if you're an ambitious player, you might want to play knight d7. The idea of knight d7 is white really doesn't want to take that if he can help it, because he's giving up the bishop pair. So if black can get white to take that, at least he has some advantage. So for example, let me just show you a typical line. A typical line goes here, and black, for example, often counterattacks on this pawn. Maybe white defends that. And then black, for example, might play this move, attacking the knight. And if the knight retreats, black's got a very comfortable game. So really, white ends up taking that. And now black's got what he wants. He has the bishop pair, but white has a big lead in development. So black has long-term winning chances, but he does have to survive the middle game. That's kind of the idea, is that white's going to try and attack in the middle game. And I think this is still okay for black theoretically, these lines. You want to look up some theory, but my impression is good players who are trying to win will very, very often play the knight d7 move. Now, there's nothing wrong, by the way, with knight c6. That's a Rossolimo line. That's a well-known Rossolimo line, and you can look at that too. Bishop d7 is the reason more players don't like this system as white. White has some options after this kind of move, where he can play c4 or play for c3, the one I just showed you. But both those are considered fine for black. So, on the other hand, Caruana beat Anand, as white in these systems, and there've been, I think Carlsen beat Anand. Maybe Caruana did too. Anyway, but you can play these systems and still get wins for white, but it's just hard to do. So I would put the knight on d. I'd learn the lines though. I'd look them up because you can get attacked. Should I feint shadow my bishop on g7 or play e6 and then bishop e7? Well, that depends on which lines you're talking about. If you're talking about the pure Grand Prix, which I don't think you were, then the fianchetto is more popular than the e6 lines, and probably more active too. I think you have more fun with the fianchetto than you do with the e6 and knight e7 kind of lines. Just my opinion. You might want to look up a little of the theory, or send me an email, ask me a question about a particular line, and we can talk about it in some detail. Because otherwise, like in most of these lines, there's so many options, it's hard to talk about just spontaneously online, because I'll get distracted. There's so many sub-variations that we could talk about. But that's a very good question, what to do in those positions. Shall I fianchetto my bishop on g6? Yeah, okay. Can you discuss ideas in the ready opening rapport used to beat Carlsen? We can't talk about that. I think I'll get to other people's questions first. What is the best method to learn how to play blindfolded? What should one practice over and over? There's this wonderful book by Elliot Hurst called Blindfold Chess by McFarlane. It's very expensive, unfortunately. It's one of these hardback books with about 600 pages. But you might be able to get it in the library or borrow a copy. But anyway, he talks about techniques for learning blindfold chess. I think one of the things Koltanowski used to say, he was a great blindfold chess expert, is that you can sit, practice naming. First of all, just get started with practice naming the colors of all the squares. Know what colors all the squares are. Just as a rapid fire test yourself on all squares. Name a square, what color is it? And you can do exercises in your mind. Like, for example, he used to do the knight's drawer. You don't have to do something that fancy, but practice moving pieces without side of the board with your eyes closed. And just practice moving one piece all around the board is a good way to kind of get started. And just build from there until you can, and then of course just ultimately you're going to practice just playing a game. You can play a game against yourself blindfold and just try it, and look at it afterwards, see what it is that you didn't find. It's a little easier to play blindfold. Once you've played a lot of chess, you'd be surprised how easy it is to play blindfold. When I was just a kid, I played a whole bunch of blindfold games simultaneously, and people thought it was amazing, but really I learned then that I think any top player can do that. Of course, to play them really, really well, that's a different issue. that's very, very different. But you'd be surprised that blindfold is not that hard once you're used to chess. Okay, semi-trush setup with white moves, d4, blah, blah, e3, bishop e2, black, knight c6, blah, blah. Took on c4 to gain tempo. What are the ideas for black? Way to take advantage. Okay, let's throw that in there. And then we should get back to questions that people sent me during the week, too. And then I'll hit that Scotch opening thing. But I think I should get back to the questions that we got during the week. Okay, so we're talking about the semi-Tarrasch opening. That's a Queen's Gambit kind of position. Now, it can come up in all kinds of different orders. For example, this is a semi-Tarrasch. And I think we talked about the other week. One thing, he's thinking about it from the black point of view. And from the black point of view, you don't have to necessarily just copy this move. This move is very flexible. And kind of the trick is that when you do take on this square and play b5, there's a knight to attack with b4. Whereas you don't have the same thing on the other side of the board. Just to show you that, let's say white played a3, for example. and black played a slow move, and white captured and went there and went there. This is kind of a fun move for, this kind of fun position, I think, for white. He puts his bishop here. He can play the move b5 at some point. For example, if black tries to break up the queen side, that's a good move. Now, look at this in reverse for a second. If you don't play the move knight c6, then that whole plan isn't so great. For example, let's say white makes a move, and you take, and you go here. Now, white can't attack this way without losing time to b4. So that's, which is kind of what we were just talking about. Whereas you don't have that same problem. Actually, what I wanted to show you first is that you don't have that problem. My fault. I should have done it that way. Let's say he plays a3 himself now, and you do something else. Wait a minute, that's not what I wanted to show you. What did I want to show you? Let's say he takes here and plays a3 or something, and you castle. He goes here. The difference now is there's no b5 move attacking a knight there. So one thing you can do is just move order him. Don't play knight c6 too early in the tirage. Now maybe you've already played knight c6, and if you have, then you can't use this technique. So your question was more like, what happens in a position where white plays bishop e2? And by the way, bishop d3 or c takes d tends to be a little better. This move, my favorite two moves in this position are c takes d and a3. And in both cases, the reason for playing it is to avoid what you're talking about. It's to avoid moving your bishop and then having to white has to play it twice, has to move his piece twice. It means black's probably equal. So you did take it to gain tempo, but what are the ideas for black? The main idea for black now is probably to create an isolated pawn here, and then develop your pieces and eventually attack. I'll show you. Let me just show you how to do that. First of all, it's black's move. Now you can even do this right away. Let's do it for simplicity's sake. Just take it right away. Now just develop. It's best to keep the queen on that pawn, so put your bishop on e7 and develop. And now white has a lot of moves here, but most common one is probably just rook here. And now there are two ways for black to play this, and they're both pretty decent. One is just to play b6, and the reason is that the bishop's got a lot of scope on that diagonal, and it holds down that square in front of it. It helps control that key square, where white would like to push that pawn sometimes. And with the bishop on b7, you're able to control that square better. The other move, which is maybe even more fun, is to play this with exactly the same idea, playing b5 and then bishop b7. And this time you're doing it with tempo, and you're maybe able to play b5, b4, driving away that knight, away from those key central squares. You could argue that those two squares in the center, e4 and d5, are the key squares in this position. So what are you going to do about those squares? Well, if you can play b5, b4, you're driving the bishop away, and then you're driving the knight away from those squares. And you might say, okay, but white just plays a4, stopping b5. The only problem then is that now black has this square that he can put this knight on, where it covers again that key square. And he can still play b6. Just make some moves for white. I'm going to make some sort of fairly harmless moves. Like that. So you can still fianchetto your bishop. It's very nicely placed there. Aims at the king, covers d5, covers e4, covers those two squares that are really being disputed. And you have this knight sitting here, which covers some nice squares in white's position, but perhaps more importantly covers d5, which is the central square you're really fighting for. So that's the setup you can make. Now, most people won't play a4, but if they don't play a4, it's really kind of a mistake, I think, to play a4. You should play something like this. But then black gets nice space over there and gets his bishop fianchettoed and has chances maybe to play this anyway. For example, if sometimes white likes to play that move, but then this move b4 is interesting because you can't take it without getting forked and losing your best piece, your bishop on a2. So that's a little start maybe for how to set up. Then we have a question about the Scotch here. Well, we got all kinds of commentary. Look at all this commentary. Well, we'll stick with the chat. People enjoy the chat. Let's stick with that for a little while. Chess is genetics. You missed my question. Which question did I miss? No, the Grand Prix. I did that one. Oh, yeah, you probably missed it by the time you said that, when you said that. Yeah, you got to remember, I'm kind of looking back and forth between the chat and this, and I also want to cover stuff from previous weeks, so I'm not going to get to these chat questions right away, and I probably won't answer them all either. Let's do this Scotch. Yeah, the old knight f5 move. I'd forgotten about that. Let me see how that goes. Okay, so we've got e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Okay, this is called the Scotch game. Instead of, for example, you probably guys know the Ruy Lopez, and you know the bishop can be the two knights defense of the Gioco Piano. This is the Ponzani, but this is the old Scotch. And this is the Scotch game here, if you play knight takes, rather than trying to gambit anything. And then bishop c5 is a move I like a lot, actually. I think that's a good move. White has several moves here. The normal one is this, but then black can make some interesting ideas, some interesting moves like queen here, for example. It's an interesting move. And another move is this, attacking the bishop, but the bishop just goes back. And what else does he have? Well, anyway, what he's asking about is this move. I think maybe did Fischer play this once? It's been played a fair amount. The problem is supposed to be that you lose too much time playing this way, and I don't know if that's true. White's main idea is that if g6 protecting that pawn, he comes back here and he has really good control over d5. I think, now here you shouldn't quote me, you should probably look it up, but I think this is considered okay for black anyway, though, just because white, this bishop's cut off. It's not like white has that much development. Black's going to have 3 pieces out, and white's only going to have 1. So I think black's considered to be okay here. The other point, though, and originally the refutation was this move d5. So he goes, d6. I think it was, I don't know, I have this funny idea at one point people were even playing d5. Because if takes, you can just take this. This could be wrong. This could be wrong. But I think originally there was this idea that, okay, after check, king here, now this pawn's hanging. So after knight here, for example, oh, well, there's moves like this. Attacking here, attacking the knight sometimes, and attacking the pawn. So that loses a rook, for example, that check. And this position is, what, practically winning? I mean, it's pretty good anyway. Well, it's not that good. But it's very, black has really fast development here. You wouldn't really want to play this as white, I don't think. Too many pieces coming out. So as I recall, d5 used to be considered a good move. There have been articles about this suggesting that white play this way, though, so that means that people still think that there's no refutation of this way playing for white. But I don't remember what you're supposed to do about d5. I think knight takes is just, it looks too risky to me. So I'm not sure. Maybe this is the problem. So in answer to your question, this is post-Yoda. I wonder about d5. You might want to look into d5. It's a very dangerous move, I remember. d6 is what you asked about, threatening to take this. Check here, and then you give knight h5. Oh, same idea, queen out. Now this is very different because now white's much more solidly placed, so I agree with you. This is different. Black's a pawn down, and he still has good development. He has, the knight coming out, maybe a rook coming here, maybe bishop here with tempo. He can, it'd still be hard to defend this, but it's very solid for white. There's no pawn up here capturing. There's no open lines like an open d file, and black can't castle either. So I don't know what the theory on this is. What did you say? Isn't this just good for white? Why doesn't white play this? I don't know how good it is. I think I'd be okay with white. I wouldn't mind being white here. You got to watch out for knight g4 now. Maybe here. Yeah, we'd have to look at the theory. Of course, then black gets the pawn back, but white has a better pawn structure, so maybe that's okay for white. You got to be a little careful though. If you start defending your center, I'm really worried about this move. This looks awfully strong. There's just too much pressure here. Probably what you want to do is give back the pawn here. I don't know why white doesn't play this. I would think what you would do here is you would play very solidly like this. And if he takes, you can't castle, and white can. And that makes me think that this attack, now it just depends how strong this attack is for black. I don't know. I think I'd rather be white. Just offhand, I think I'd rather be white, but it is dangerous. It's really dangerous, It goes like that, puts a rook here, brings a bishop out, threatens this, threatens this. The knight can come into central squares. It's scary. So we'd have to look up the theory. Maybe I'll do that for next week. It's a fascinating question. I don't know the theory. Take a look at d5, because that's not my old memory. Way back when, I remember thinking that that's a tough move to meet. So why don't you try that, look that up, and I'll look it up for next week. I'll save this and look this up for next week. Very good question. Okay. Raymond would beat anybody. Your commentary for that round. I'm commenting again for tomorrow's round in Tata Steel, so you guys can tune in. That's ICC commentary. We have a recap of the round. I usually show about 3 games. And it should be fun. The tournament's getting exciting. We're getting towards the end here. Carlsen won today, so he's only a half point behind first. I don't like the increment. You should just get 5 seconds to move the piece. Yeah, I like the increment, but that's because I'm old and I need the extra time. So yeah, that's a matter of opinion. I actually really like increment. I think it's fun. It means there aren't as many games decided in the flurry of just throwing pieces around and making blunders. But if you really, it just depends how you look at chess. I like there to be good moves. I mean, I'm sort of theoretical about my chess, whereas as a sport, of course, it's more exciting to just get 5 seconds and have to move and people making big blunders all over the place. From a sort of artistic, scientific point of view, of course, you want the game to be slower, but it's a matter of taste. You know, the sporting element is sure fun, and it's what most people like most, so just a question of taste, really. I tend to like the quality of play more, so I tend to want as much time as possible. Fischer wrote The King's Gambit was busted back in the 60s, but I think I had a Foxy openings video where Morozevich won a great game with white with it. Nobody told Audubon it was busted. Yeah, Audubon just played in, Viscount say he played The King's Gambit. There's a huge book by John Shaw, 600 pages or something by Quality Chess, about The King's Gambit. I don't think anybody thinks it's busted at all, not even close, but there's so many good lines against it, it seems to me. I think the problem with The King's Gambit is not that it's bad, it's that almost every defense is okay for black. That's my feeling. And I don't know as much as John Shaw is. He might argue with that. He might say, oh no, white's better in many of these lines. The other thing is there's a book that just came out, a self-published book by Tim Taylor, which is $90 or something, so it must be just, I don't know how many pages, another 600 or 700, 800 pages about The King's Gambit. So people aren't writing these lengthy volumes if there's an easy refutation of it, obviously. There's still some reasonable people that play The King's Gambit. Okay, I use the classical and hope my opponent gets greedy. Depends what you mean by classical. Anyway, here's The King's Gambit, for those who don't know. God, I always got to remember there's people that don't. There's pretty experienced players on this site watching this, and there's just people that haven't seen too much chess. That's called The King's Gambit. The idea is that if black takes it, you try to establish a big center, you try to win your pawn back, and then you have not only a big center, but you have the open F file. It's kind of a basic idea. And I don't know what now I know a student of mine, Abby Marshall, who won the Denker Championship in the high school championship in the United States, played that. So we studied this for years, playing this as white. And it's perfectly good, by the way. So the King's Gambit is okay even in this line. But the main move by far is this one, stopping Queen H4 check. Just for the record, just so you know, if you want to have some fun with this line, this is the problem with Queen H4 check here is that the queen loses more time. So even though the king can't move, not that Queen H4 check is a bad move, but it's not so easy because white gets an awful lot of development. So instead of that, this is the main move, and I don't know what you mean by classical. I mean, what's called the modern sometimes has to do with this move, going like this and then attacking here. The Kieseritzky has to do with playing this move G5. Fischer started with this move and played G5, and H6 and G5 is a very common setup, the Becker defense. The Kieseritzky is probably the most important one. It's the one that uses up most of the room in the books, this nonsense. You'll just find infinite amounts of material about this position in these King's Indian books. But there's plenty of defenses. You can also play, you can decline the King's Gambit. A couple ways to do that. One is to play with F5, like here, for example. The main traditional way to decline it is here, which I think is perfectly sound for black, by the way. This, and then white can play either for C3 or knight C3. It's complicated. I think black's okay in the King's Gambit decline. That's the traditional decline. You decline with this move, and I think I showed you guys the other day, we were talking about this, that if white plays here, the normal gambit line is this, the Falkbeer counter gambit. You can even also play this weird little gambit here. But if you want to, you can transpose into that modern line by playing there. And now we have the same position I showed you earlier. So D5 is possible. I also showed you guys this kind of thing. It's called the Keen defense. You check, weaken his position a little, and put the queen there where it's attacking down this way. All kinds of lines. I don't know what the classical line is, unfortunately. Maybe you can tell me that, actually. Okay. Oh, and there's the Cunningham, right? I forgot about the Cunningham. There's the this idea, the idea of playing bishop check. And that can get really crazy because sometimes white just sort of gives away everything. Now, actually, usually black doesn't even play this check, but one totally, speaking of getting greedy, this is a very funny line. Check. Okay, black won 3 pawns, but white has a huge attack on that square. And actually, I don't even know if black's not able to defend this, but in reality, if you don't know it by heart, I think you're going to get slaughtered, right? Because white has so much attack going on. That's the Cunningham defense. I think I'm forgetting a few others. There's many ways to play this kind of stuff. But let me see. had played knight c6 earlier and transposed, but good information about knight c6 timing. Oh, okay, that was about that Tarrasch thing. Yeah. Oh, okay. And what I was trying to say is, if you have played knight c6 already, I hope you got that part. That in the semi-Tarrasch, what you're really playing for there. What you did was great. You made him move his bishop twice, and then you isolate. And then what I'm saying you could do there is isolate his d pawn and just play a normal isolated d pawn position as black. So even if you have played knight c6, that's okay. Okay, Kasparov played the Scots sometimes. Yes. d6. Okay, so d5 is the problem. Well, I'm not sure. I would look into it. Don't take my word for it. I'm not an expert on this at all, post-Yoda, but I just got that in the back of my mind. This is from 20 or 30 years ago that I remember that, so I could be just making this up. Just a reminder, if you want, please like this video. Thank you. King Crusher and Chess Explainer playing a blitz match on ICC soon. Okay, well, don't leave us. Bishop c5 on the third move. Spassky played a great game in the... Oh, yeah, you're talking about the King's Gambit decline. You can just play Bishop c5. Yeah, it's a good move. That's the second move, actually, but that's okay. Spassky played a great game in the King's Gambit in the 60s. Yes, he played many great games. Spassky played the King's Gambit quite a bit. The game they used for Russia with Love, yeah. One of the better things in a movie, because it was actually correct. So many the games are incorrect, the boards are set up wrong. There was an article about how in more than 50% of the time the board is set up wrong in movies in chess, which is hard to do. Meaning just the right-hand corner being white, the lower right-hand corner, which is sort of astounding because it means there's a correlation. There's a negative correlation. It should be a random. It should be 50-50 if people know nothing at all. But instead they not only know nothing at all, but they manage to get it wrong more often than right. Little mystery, some psychological thing going on there. Yes, Bishop c5. Thank you, Christopher. That's the King's Gambit decline. That's the one I mentioned. Obviously you hadn't, I hadn't said that yet. Little info I have found on the Sicilian Four Knights, just never gained much popularity, main ideas. I think it's a fun opening, actually. Tons of theory on the King's Gambit. Yes, absolutely, there's tons of theory. It's an issue. Okay, that's the last comment I got. Let me mention the Sicilian Four Knights. I'll tell you what I'll do, though. I'll get right back to that. Let me keep moving on stuff that people have sent me, and we'll never get to it. Somebody asked me a question. How do you play as black in the English when they put their pawns on e4 and c4 like some kind of Maroczy bind? One reason I wanted to answer this question is because it's kind of a general question, but because so many people ask me about the Maroczy bind and what to do about it. So even though this isn't a full answer to that, it's a related question. Let me see. It'd be better if I could actually bring up the game for you. So I'm going to just show a classic old game that I put in one of my old books just to illustrate the English opening with the Maroczy bind. This is an example of what's called the hedgehog. So here you go with your English opening with a Maroczy bind. Okay, so we get that move. That's the Maroczy bind there. That's that kind of position in an English opening. Now, why do I give this game? Just basically to show some of the themes, but I wanted to show you that that can happen many ways. I mean, that can happen after just very simple moves like, let me show you something like this. This is one of the old main lines you play here. This is a way to set up for black. And it's an answer to your question that you can simply set up, allow the Maroczy bind, and then play this move and play solidly. Now, move orders are always tricky. You can play a6. There's all kinds of possible moves. So there's many English openings where you can set up what's called the hedgehog formation. And the hedgehog formation, just to get back to the game again, is this e6, d6 thing with b6. So this is you can always set up this structure, basically. These moves, you can pretty much always make these moves against a hedgehog formation, or against an e4, c4 structure in the English opening. Most of the time you can get these moves in. Not always, but most of the time. And what's the idea here? The idea here is, first of all, black has a central majority. Oh, sorry, I did that. Little flip of the wrist there. So first of all, the idea is that black has a central majority. See these 2 pawns to 1? That's the same advantage you have in the Sicilian defense. This is like a Sicilian defense. Notice that black's played c5, and then white's played d4, and black's taken. Okay? So you have that central majority. That's a nice advantage because it really restricts whites from making progress in the center, and it means a lot of times you're threatening to maybe play d5 later. Let me make a couple more moves. I think that'll help. Just kind of get black castled if nothing else, right? Let's get some moves in. There we go. Okay, so what are the themes here? Well, white's theme is I've just got more space than you. I've got 2 pawns in the 4th rank. You have nothing on the 4th rank. I'm just more active, and I have good active pieces, and I'm going to put a rook on an open file in the center and try and hold down your pieces. Why would black play this way? Well, black has not only has his pieces very flexibly placed, but he has the central majority. That's the main reason he's playing this, actually. And by having that, it means that moves like b5 are always threatened to distract the pawns from stopping your central majority from moving. Moves like d5 are often threatened, just moving the central majority forward and opening up all sorts of pieces. What did black play here? Maybe we should make another move or two. Okay, there. Now, for example, a move like d5 now, if white starts taking things, that opens up this rook, but it also d5 opens up this bishop. So black gets these counterattacks. This is what's called an elastic position for black. And that means, sure, it looks like he's doing nothing, but the minute he starts making some of these dynamic moves, good things can happen. Where all of his pieces come leaping into life. And white has to kind of think about stopping those moves. And because white has to stop those moves, it's harder for him to pay attention to his own attack. So this is a very, very old game. This is Ullman and Dorian, and both great players. And white's trying to use his space advantage. He's very reluctant to play f4 because he's worried about the bishop coming out to that diagonal after a move like d5 at some point, or e5 and d5. Okay, and black's just making moves, getting all his pieces onto squares where they dynamically, now they're both, neither of those are open files, but both of them could be open files very easily. Either if white opens them by attacking, or if black plays d5 or e5 and attacks. So they're potentially open files. So these kind of systems are really good to learn for both colors. It's just an even game, but a very fascinating game. Now black's brought the queen over to get pressure this way. This pawn is pinned so they can't move forward because the bishop would be taken on g2. So black made this elaborate idea of putting the bishop there, and then came back and fianchettoed it after all, which makes this a little weaker on d6 because there's no bishop protecting it. So white tries to take advantage of that. You'll see that. White plays here. In fact, black just gave up a pawn here by doing this because white's able to attack and then give it up. But black had a counterattack planned, specifically that move. And the idea is the knight's going to come in here. Well, in the meantime, white gets a second pawn and then gives up the exchange because he has to. If he plays rook here, see how that rook's attacked? If he plays the rook over, there's this problem with knight here, attacking this knight and this bishop. Let me see if I can just show that to you. If white played, I don't know, something like this, we would get this here, and then this move, and this bishop is swinging into life. So black's only one pawn down, but he has a huge attack. His bishops are very strong. The light squares around white's king are too loose. There's too many weaknesses. Notice black's king is pretty safe. White's king is very exposed here. So this position would probably favor black. Not necessarily, but it's at least enough for a pawn anyway. Okay, so let me go back to the game. So black gets his material back. It's kind of even material. Black, it's a rook, a piece and 2 pawns for a rook is considered pretty even. And what else is going on? Well, black's pretty active, and he wants to get these dark squares. He wants to work on these dark squares. I'll show you a few more moves. I really just wanted to show you kind of how to set up this position. White's probably not making the best moves here because black is starting to get some control of these dark squares. See all those squares? Black's getting some kind of serious activity here. I think it was still fairly even until very soon now. Black takes over that d file, and that's a mistake because black ended up pinning that knight. And it's not just that he's pinning that knight, it's that he's getting a lot of activity. He's penetrating the position. I don't know how much more I really need to show here. He actually ended up taking the queens off because there's a couple pawns hanging. And I guess I'll just stop there, make a few more moves maybe, but there, that happened. And black was a pawn up and eventually won the game. But anyway, I just want to show you that basic kind of setup against the Maroczy bind in the English opening, which was the question. Most English openings, if white sets up a Maroczy bind, you can set up that position for black if you want to. Okay. Oh, the Sicilian Four Knights. So let's do that. That's a fair question. Fascinating opening. Not better than its reputation, I think. There was a book called Meeting E4 by Alexander Raetsky. It's pretty old, but it's still got a lot of really good analysis. This is called the Sicilian Four Knights. Now, you may have seen a lot of other Sicilians. Let me just sort of explain that. This is the Scheveningen Sicilian. This is called the Paulsen Sicilian, the Kahn variation, or maybe sometimes it's called, if you play it in this order, it's called maybe a Taimanov, especially if you play there, that's a Taimanov Sicilian or A6. There's the, what else is there? Let me just, well, you know some other Sicilians. We've looked at the Dragon and the Najdorf a lot. The Dragon has to do with playing G6. The Najdorf has to do with playing A6, and you can go back into that Scheveningen thing we talked about. There's the Sveshnikov. Oh, well, there's tons of different ones. When you play E6, let's just look at this. The Four Knights is a unique one for the Sicilian. Usually what happens in the Sicilian is black gets behind in development and space, and in return he gets a central majority. Most of the Sicilians. Black makes a lot of slow moves. A pawn here, maybe another pawn here, a bishop here. Makes a lot of slow, inactive moves. White gets space and white gets a lot of development, but black has an excellent pawn structure. The Four Knights Sicilian is a very unique beast because, by the way, this is called the pin Sicilian here, and it's not considered that good for sort of tactical reasons. Maybe playable, probably not. I mean, not if against perfect play. This is similar. You play here. This is the other Sicilian where black is not playing to get behind in development, get a good pawn structure, but on the contrary, he often gets ahead in development. He's often ahead in development. For example, in this line, which is sort of the main line, and black plays that move, and white can play things like bishop f4, but black's getting his pieces out really quickly and breaking in the center. None of this d6 stuff. He's playing with d5, playing really aggressively. And there's tons of theory on this. One slightly discouraging line sorry, let me see, it's white's move here, knight here. One slightly discouraging. Now, if you play here, by the way, you might get back into a Sveshnikov or a Sveshnikov-like position with this kind of position. And then if black takes this, white can take on that square, trying to divert the queen because he has a check down there. So black has to take that way. So that's one way of getting into a Sveshnikov kind of position. But if you're playing the pure Sicilian Four Knights, you don't do that. In the pure Sicilian Four Knights, you play here, threatening knight takes pawn. And white will often just sacrifice that pawn also, by the way. One thing white can do is play very slowly, like that, just to get the bishop pair. That's a common approach. Black gets a real nice central presence, but white gets the bishop pair. So that's one issue with the Sicilian Four Knights. These main lines are just crazy. For example, let me see if I can do this right. You can leave that guy hanging, and for example, play here, knight takes, and now if check, the king can go to either f8 or e7. I never remember which one's best. I think you can play either one. Maybe f8 is more common these days, I'm not sure. And the idea is that if white would take that, all of a sudden this guy's hanging. So you have queen f6, hitting here, hitting indirectly that square, which is a mate, and hitting that 3 times. And you have plenty of counterplay here, more than enough. White shouldn't play this way. So that's one thing. So usually after knight takes e4, white plays queen. Well, the old move is queen f3. I think there's a bunch of options, but queen f3 is the one I remember best. Still thinking about playing knight down. And then black often still gives up material, just lets him play knight check, and tries to put his queen again over to maybe f6. Anyway, this goes on and on. What was the question? The question was, why don't people play it? Never gained much popularity. Yeah, maybe partly because, there's one other Four Knights I have to mention. Important Four Knights. What am I thinking of? Sorry. What's the other line I'm the other obvious thing I'm missing here? Taking. I'm sorry. Of course. Yeah, capturing. Okay. And then this is just a very bad endgame for black because the dark squares are so weak and the king's stuck in the center. It's not really an endgame. It's still kind of a middle game. So you take this way and then white plays here. That's the other main line. I think at the top level, the last time we saw the Four Knights, Sicilian Four Knights being played a lot, this was the line white was choosing quite a bit. So this might be the reason you don't see it that often. Very complicated line. White's main move here by far is this, just to get pressure there. The threat is to play c4 and throw a knight in there and get all the dark squares. just dominate the dark squares. And black has several moves here. He has bishop here, queen check followed by queen b6, queen c7. There's even a line where you play the queen several times. You end up moving the queen several times. But anyway, this is a common position. This happens a bunch. Queen c7 is a fairly common move. And if that move, then you come back to b6, which stops him from castling and thinks about knight e3 in some positions. And this goes on and on. There's a bishop a6 in this line. I think the real experts in the for a little while, the real experts in the Sicilian Four Knights were not playing queen b6 or queen a5 or queen c7 or any of those moves. They were playing bishop b7 with the idea of just playing c5 and trying to get the long diagonal. There's a lot of concrete theory. My impression is probably the whole thing's slightly underrated, but maybe a little bit thankless, because the positions you get are all slightly worse. And maybe you don't have enough counter prospects in a lot of these lines. I'm just guessing. But it's certainly a playable line. It's something you could play. You'd be surprised. You'd probably win a lot of games with it. People don't know it as white. Okay, an opponent said I was playing cabbage recently. I don't know what he meant. Probably cabbage sounds insulting. It sounds like he doesn't like what you were playing. Okay, so maybe I caught up with the chat a little bit. Yeah, okay, so we caught up with the chat a little. So let me catch up on some stuff from the last few weeks. Okay, here's something I've been stalling on for a long time. What's the time here? Oh, too late. Darn. Do it next week. It has to do with this exchange French I keep getting asked about. So I'll tell you about that next week. And sorry I went on so long about those examples, because we're already pretty much out of time. Okay, one last question here. Can you think of a concrete way to just think about playing for an intermediate player? Concrete way to just think about playing. Wow. Yeah, I'm not sure what to say about that. Most of chess it's like music, it's like anything else, a language. It has to do with practice, a lot of practice. That's how you get to think. You get to think by practice. You get to practice to thinking about things. I mean, I'm sure you know some of the basic things, which is you have to learn how to figure out, well, if he takes that and I take it back and he takes that, who's ahead at the end of everything? Just he goes here, I go there is the initial concrete thing. I like to tell all my students to, even when they get pretty advanced, to make sure that before they make their move, check out all the checks and the captures and the forcing moves, both for your side and for his side. That's very concrete. Look at every check on the board and make sure you have a good answer for that. Look at the captures. Just so the most concrete thing is just to start out for playing, even as an intermediate, is to be sure you look at the forcing moves. Don't forget. Don't get too involved in strategy until you've covered the bases, the basics, tactics, that kind of thing. That's a very tough question. How to play? Yeah, thinking about playing in general, I don't even know what the answer would be, because every position is different and every line. There's no universal way to think. If there was, everyone would use it, and they'd win all their games, or no one would win any games because they'd all know it so easily. If you could put into words a way to think about chess, in general, then chess probably wouldn't be the game that it is. But it's a good question. As I say, play a lot. I mean, I'll give advice rather than telling you how to think. I'll just give advice. If you play a lot, you learn a lot of positions, and you study a lot, you'll find out how to think about positions. You'll find out how to look at key squares. If you just start out and being told to look at all the weak squares in the position and try to dominate them or something, you'll never get very good, because there's too many positions that have too many exceptions. So you need to kind of learn by trial and error to a large extent. You really do. And of course, study as much as you can, and think in terms of principles as much as you can, but mostly you're just getting better. It's just like any other field. There's no magic bullet. You just have to get used to playing a lot. It's a very good question. Okay, okay, folks, I'm sorry it got so late so fast, but I will hopefully see you next week. Remember to send me questions at askimwatson@chessclub.com. Send me your games. It doesn't have to be a good game. It can be full of blunders. That's fine, but hopefully if you do send me a game, try and have it maybe associated with a question that you have, or some comment that you have, like, I messed this up. What can I do to improve my play and not make this kind of mistake? or just send me something and I can come up with reasons why it's probably educational and or not. And I'll try to show as many of those games as I can, because I've noticed that people really like having their games shown. Okay, thanks everybody, and I'll see you next week.